The Furiani disaster was a devastating stadium collapse on May 5, 1992, at the Armand Cesare Stadium in Furiani, Corsica. It remains one of the worst disasters in French sporting history. We'll provide an in-depth look at the events leading up to that tragic south of Bastia on the French island of Corsica. The stadium was originally built in 1932 and underwent renovations over the decades. By the 1990s, the aging stadium was undoubtedly in need of upgrades. The beloved local team, SC Bastia, had recently been promoted to Ligue 1, France's top football division, for the first time in their history. To accommodate larger crowds, the club installed temporary stands at each end of the stadium. On May 5, 1992, SC Bastia was set to host Olympique de Marseille in the French Cup semifinal second leg. This was an enormous match. Marseille were the defending league champions and had become a powerhouse in French football over the past decade under their controversial but successful chairman, Bernard Tapie. Marseille had a star-studded roster, including players like Chris Waddle, Abedi Pele. A sellout crowd exceeding 16,000 was expected, which would nearly triple Furiani's small local population. Leading up to the match, it became clear that demand for tickets far exceeded the expanded but still modest stadium's capacity. The president of SC Bastia, Jean-François Philippe, petitioned the French Football Federation to move the match to the larger Stade Vélodrome in Marseille. However, the federation refused, citing neutrality reasons. Some in the local community also raised concerns about the safety of the temporary stands, yet the match went ahead anyway. Many fans arrived early to soak up the atmosphere, waving flags and letting off flares in the parking lot. One group of Bastia supporters arriving from Ajaccio got lost on the way and nearly missed the kickoff. It was around 8:20 p.m., just 20 minutes before kickoff, when disaster struck. The temporary stand holding over 8,000 spectators behind the goal at the south end of the stadium suddenly collapsed. In an instant, thousands of fans plunged nearly 50 feet or 15 meters to the ground. Along with over 2,500 tons of concrete and twisted metal. Eyewitness accounts describe an initial moment of horrified silence before the screaming started. A dense cloud of dust enveloped the wreckage. People were trapped under piles of debris or clinging to those around them to avoid falling farther. The scale of the disaster was visible from across the stadium. Emergency services responded quickly but were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the collapse. Some fans rushed onto the pitch to help, while players and staff from both teams also assisted rescuers in pulling people from the rubble. Cutters were used to free those trapped under metal beams. The injured were carried out on billboards, banners, or any flat surface available. The match was swiftly abandoned. Floodlights illuminated the rubble-strewn scene of chaos and distress throughout the night as emergency crews and volunteers searched desperately for survivors. It soon became apparent that the death toll would be severe. In the immediate aftermath, 18 people were confirmed dead, with over 2,300 injured. The initial death toll was feared to be much higher, potentially over 100 based on ticket sales, which fortunately proved inaccurate. Several players and staff suffered minor injuries too, though no one connected to either club was seriously hurt. A day of national mourning was declared on May 6th. The French government ordered the inspection of stadiums nationwide and implemented strict bans on standing terraces and temporary structures. Several officials connected to the Furiani Stadium were later given jail sentences for manslaughter through negligence. The 1990s saw major reforms in French football, influenced heavily by the Furiani disaster. New laws on stadium safety fundamentally changed the matchday experience, favoring all-seater arenas. In the aftermath of the disaster, investigators moved quickly to determine what caused the catastrophic failure of the South Stand. Analysis found clear evidence of dangerous flaws in the stand's hasty construction. The original contractors, Sud Tribune, had been hired to build the additional stands only 3 months prior to the match. To meet the tight deadline, serious corners were cut that compromised safety. For example, insufficient concrete was used in columns supporting the structure. Expert analysis later deemed the concrete strength to be just a third of what would normally be required for such a stand. This major defect meant the columns were far more vulnerable to buckling. In addition, there were inadequate load-bearing beams installed to disperse weight and stress. The contractors also failed to include a proper number of shear walls within the stand. Shear walls provide critical structure support and resilience against lateral forces. Finally, the number of safety barriers in front of the seating was also well below the norm. Only one barrier with insufficient retention strength was in place, meaning there was nothing to prevent a cascade of spectators once failure occurred. The combination of these failings led to total structural collapse. Investigations concluded that the stand had been constructed cheaply and hastily, without the necessary engineering rigor to support thousands of spectators. The resultant criminal and civil lawsuits lasted many years after the disaster itself. The reasons for the disaster are clear. A stadium stand that was commissioned rapidly, built negligently without adequate safeguards, and ultimately unable to withstand the weight of the crowd. This stark demonstration of human error and adherence to budgets over safety led to calls for strict new standards in French stadium design. 30 years on, the Furiani disaster remains France's worst-ever stadium tragedy. The victims are remembered annually by football fans across Corsica and beyond. SC Bastia's Stade Armand Cesari was completely renovated during the 1990s, reopening in 1997 with a new South Stand dedicated to those who died. The disaster marked French football profoundly, leading to lasting reforms that guaranteed safer conditions for spectators. However, Furiani also demonstrated the fallibility of human decision-making driven by emotion rather than safety. Without proper oversight, the unacceptable can become normalized. For Corsica, France, and football as a whole, the tragic events of May 5, 1992, will never be forgotten. Though born of negligence, the legacies of Furiani also include modernized stadiums and stricter safety regulations, which prevent disasters on such scales today.